The Queen has expressed her sincere wish for Camilla, the Duchess of Cornwall, to be known as Queen Consort when Prince Charles becomes king.
In March 2024, at the Commonwealth Day service in Westminster Abbey, cameras caught something small that royal watchers immediately seized on. As senior royals filed in to greet King Charles and Queen Camilla, the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh both delivered the expected bow and curtsy to the King and Queen in turn. The Princess of Wales did the same. Then Princess Anne arrived. She kissed her brother's cheek and curtsied to him without hesitation. But when she reached Camilla, she offered only a kiss on each cheek and turned away no curtsy at all. The clip spread fast. Some viewers read it as a deliberate snub, a 75-year-old woman refusing to bend the knee to a queen consort she'd never fully accepted. Others pointed out, correctly, that royal protocol on this point is genuinely more complicated than it looks. Since Charles's coronation, the rules were adjusted so that other women born into the royal family princesses by blood, holding their own shirach styling independent of marriage, are not required to curtsy to Camilla the way someone like the Duchess of Edinburgh, who entered the family by marriage into a lower rank, still is. Whether Anne's choice that day was etiquette or edge, nobody outside the family actually knows. What's true is that the moment was real, it was filmed, and it reopened a decades-old conversation about how Anne feels about her brother's wife. That conversation has a real history behind it, and it doesn't require any invented confrontation to be interesting. Anne and Camilla have known each other since the early 1970s, when their social circles overlapped closely enough that a shared connection, Andrew Parker Bowles, who dated both women at different points before marrying Camilla in 1973, became a permanent footnote in royal biography. Anne went on to marry Captain Mark Phillips that same year, a marriage that ended in divorce nearly 2 decades later. Camilla's own marriage to Parker Bowles ended in 1995, by which point her relationship with Charles, which had continued on and off for years, was an open secret. None of this required a script to invent. Royal biographers have documented it for decades, and it explains, without any need for melodrama, why the relationship between these two women has always had a layer of history beneath the public courtesies. When Charles finally married Camilla in 2005, the coldness in the family was visible without anyone needing to allege anything. Queen Elizabeth did not attend the civil ceremony, choosing instead to appear only at the blessing that followed at Windsor. Photographs from the day show a family arranging itself carefully for the cameras rather than a family celebrating warmly. Ahead of the wedding, courtiers did draw up a formal document commissioned by the late Queen's private secretary spelling out exactly who in the family would be expected to curtsy or bow to Camilla and who would not. Royal biographer Craig Brown has written about how seriously Elizabeth herself took questions of precedence and how unusual it was to need a written document to settle them within the family rather than relying on convention. That document is real. It reflected genuine uncertainty about where a twice-divorced woman marrying into the family after a long public affair would sit in the order of things. It didn't require Anne screaming in a hallway to be significant. The paperwork itself was the story. For years afterward, journalists and royal watchers tracked the temperature between the two women through small, deniable gestures rather than declared war. Who stood next to whom in photographs, who exchanged how many words at a garden party, how warmly or coolly a comment was delivered in an interview. After Prince Philip's death in 2021, several royal commentators, including biographer Angela Levin, noted that the family visibly pulled closer together to support the late Queen through her grief, and that whatever chill had existed between Anne and Camilla seemed to soften somewhat in that period out of necessity rather than sudden affection. By the time of Charles's coronation in 2023, Anne gave interviews describing Camilla's adjustment to public life warmly, calling her support for the king outstanding. Whether that reflected a genuine thaw or simply the discipline both women have always shown in public is something outsiders can reasonably debate. But there is no verified reporting of either woman contradicting those public statements with a private blowout. Then there's the more serious thread running underneath all of this. What's actually happening to Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie? This part is real, it's well documented, and it doesn't need to be exaggerated to be significant. Reporting from British outlets in early 2026 indicates that the sisters were left off the guest list for Royal Ascot's Royal Box and Carriage Procession this year, an event they'd attended for most of their adult lives. That decision follows the arrest of their father, Prince Andrew, in February 2026. In connection with newly surfaced documents tied to the Epstein case allegations concerning the sharing of sensitive materials that go beyond his earlier, already damaging associations. Multiple outlets reported that Prince William specifically requested that no photographs be taken pairing him with his cousins ahead of this year's racing season. A sign that the institutional distancing is being driven from the top of the working royal family rather than from any single grudge. Sarah Ferguson's own financial history with Epstein, detailed in newly reported correspondence, has added another layer neither sister asked for and neither can control. This is the part of the story that has actual moral weight, and it's worth sitting with honestly. Beatrice and Eugenie have not been accused of wrongdoing. They built adult lives, careers, and families largely outside the full-time working royal structure, and reporting suggests Beatrice in particular was blindsided by how deep her parents' entanglement with Epstein really went, having spent time helping manage the fallout rather than being part of creating it. Watching two women lose access to events they grew up attending because of decisions in relationships that were never theirs is a genuinely uncomfortable thing to witness. Whether or not you think the institution's caution is justified, it's also notably not something the reporting attributes to Camilla at all. Every account points to William and to the broader post-Epstein arrest recalibration of the monarchy, not to a queen consort settling old scores. If there's a real tension worth discussing in this family right now, it's that one not an invented shouting match. King Charles's cancer diagnosis, announced in February 2024, is also real and well documented, and it has genuinely reshaped how the family operates. The palace confirmed he would step back from public-facing duties for a period while continuing state paperwork and his weekly audiences, and confirmed only that the cancer was not prostate cancer, despite it having been discovered during treatment for a benign prostate condition. Camilla's public role visibly expanded during his treatment, as did scrutiny of who was and wasn't appearing at family events in his place. By the end of 2025, Charles had returned to a full public schedule, completing more royal engagements than any other member of the family that year. Anne, true to her long-standing reputation, has for years been either the most or second most active working royal by engagement count, a role she's held since she began royal duties in 1969 at the age of 18. These are the real pressures on this family right now: illness, institutional damage control after a genuine scandal, and the ordinary friction of a family whose every gesture gets photographed. None of it needs an invented palace brawl to be worth talking about. It's worth pausing on why videos like the one this script is responding to exist at all, because understanding that is useful whether you watch royal content casually or take it seriously. Content built around phrases like insiders claim or sources say without a single named source, specific date, or verifiable event isn't reporting, it's a format. It borrows the tone of journalism because that tone reads as credible, while giving the creator total freedom to invent anything that keeps someone watching. A real story about Beatrice and Eugenie losing their place at Ascot because of their father's arrest is genuinely sad and genuinely newsworthy. But it doesn't have a villain, a shouting match, or a clean emotional arc, so it gets rewritten with one grafted on. Camilla becomes the cold stepmother figure and becomes the righteous defender. A real, complicated institutional decision becomes a simple morality play with a confrontation scene that never happened. This works because the royal family is a closed system. Nobody outside a very small circle knows what's said in private, which means almost any claim about a private conversation is functionally unfalsifiable. A creator can say a fight reportedly happened in front of staff, and there's no palace statement that will ever specifically deny that exact claim, because palaces generally don't respond point by point to anonymous gossip. That silence then gets read by some viewers as confirmation, when it's actually just standard practice. Buckingham Palace does not typically comment on unverified tabloid stories, whether they're true or invented. It's also worth noticing how these scripts tend to blur real, sourced details with invented ones, so that the false parts borrow credibility from the true parts. The Commonwealth Day curtsy really happened. The 1970s dating history really happened. The 2005 precedents document really existed. Weaving a fabricated hallway confrontation into the same narrative using the same confident tone makes the invented part feel just as solid as the documented parts. That's not really royal reporting, it's using verified history as camouflage for fiction. If you're consuming a lot of this content, the most useful habit is to ask a simple question of any specific claim. Is there a named source, a dated event, or a direct quote attributed to an actual person who was there? If the answer is no, and the only attribution is insiders or sources, it's worth treating the claim as entertainment rather than as something that happened. Because there's clearly an appetite for the emotional shape of this story, a monarch caught between two powerful women in his life while managing illness, and a family in crisis hears that story told honestly, as fiction, with invented characters standing in for the real royal family. Nothing below is a claim about any real person. The kingdom of Aldermere had weathered worse than this, or so its people liked to believe. King Edmund had waited nearly 70 years to take the throne, watching his mother reign with an endurance that had started to feel less like a monarchy and more like geology, slow, permanent, immovable. When the crown finally came to him, it arrived wrapped in a diagnosis. The royal physicians called it a treatable cancer privately and told the public almost nothing else. Edmund kept working anyway, because that was the only thing he knew how to do with grief and fear, turn them into paperwork. His wife, Queen Rosalind, had spent 3 decades being told by the press that she was a scandal wearing a crown. She had learned to survive it by becoming useful relentlessly, visibly useful, until usefulness became its own kind of armor. When Edmund's treatments forced him out of public view, Rosalind stepped into the gap without being asked twice. She opened hospitals, she hosted diplomats, she learned, in the space of a year, exactly how much weight a single person could carry before something in the structure underneath began to groan. Edmund's sister, Princess Helena, had never once been fooled by armor. She had watched Rosalind's rise from the very beginning, back when they were both young women orbiting the same reckless cavalry officer, and she had never fully let go of what that betrayal had cost her, not the officer, whom she'd stopped caring about decades ago, but the sense that trust in her own family had a hairline crack running through it that never quite closed. Helena was, by any fair account, the hardest-working member of the family. She attended more engagements than anyone, said less to journalists than anyone, and asked for exactly nothing in return. What she could not do, even after 50 years of practice, was watch cruelty dressed up as policy and stay quiet about it. The cruelty, this time, wore the shape of 2 young women, Helena's nieces, Princess Wren and Princess Marigold, daughters of the family's most disgraced son. Their father's scandals were his own, a decade of terrible judgment, a criminal case that had finally caught up with him, a fortune of shame that belonged entirely to him and to no one else. But the crown, it turned out, did not believe in inherited innocence. Quietly, over the course of a single season, Wren and Marigold were removed from the family's public calendar. No carriage at the summer races, no garden parties, no official mention when Marigold announced she was expecting her 3rd child, a silence so calculated it read louder than any statement could have. Helena did not believe, even for a moment, that this had come from Edmund. Her brother liked his nieces. He'd quietly arranged a small trust for reign after their father's title was stripped. A private kindness he'd never publicized because he knew it would be read as taking sides. No, Helena believed, rightly or wrongly, she could never quite prove it either way, that the architecture of this exclusion had been built by people around the throne who cared more about the institution's reputation than about 2 women who had done nothing wrong. And however unfair it might have been to lay all of that at Rosalind's feet, Helena's mind kept returning to the same person, The queen, who had spent 30 years learning that survival meant being useful to the institution above all else, and who might, Helena feared, have decided that Wren and Marigold were no longer useful to it at all. She raised it first quietly, in a private audience with Edmund that went nowhere, because Edmund, exhausted, ill, trying to hold a fracturing family together with one hand while running a country with the other, simply said he would look into it, and then didn't, because there was always something more urgent, and there always would be, until there wasn't. So Helena did what she had always done when quiet didn't work. She made herself impossible to ignore. At a summer garden party, under a sky heavy with the kind of gray that never quite commits to rain, she crossed the lawn to where Rosalind stood making pleasant conversation with a foreign ambassador, and she waited, with the patience of someone who has spent a lifetime waiting for the right moment to say an unwelcome thing, until the ambassador had moved on. Rosalind's expression didn't change, which Helena had always found more unsettling than any visible reaction could be. "I know a great many things happen in this family that I have no hand in," Rosalind said. "You'd do well to remember how little any of us actually control." "They've done nothing," Helena said. "Whatever their father did, whatever he deserves it, isn't theirs to carry." "No," Rosalind agreed, and for a moment something almost like tiredness crossed her face. "It isn't. I've said as much myself, if you'd ever bothered to ask instead of assuming." She glanced past Helena, toward the small crowd of staff and guests that had begun, almost imperceptibly, to notice that this conversation had gone somewhere private conversations at garden parties weren't supposed to go. "But you have spent 50 years deciding who I am before I open my mouth, Helena, and I am tired of being convenient to blame. If you want to fight for those girls, fight the people actually making these decisions. Don't fight me because I'm standing still long enough to hit." It was, staff would later say quietly, to no one who'd repeat it publicly, one of the only times either woman had raised her voice within earshot of anyone who worked for them. Edmund arrived a few minutes later, drawn by the particular stillness that settles over a room when everyone in it is pretending not to have heard something. He said little. He rarely did, these days. Illness had taught him to save his energy for the fights that mattered, and he wasn't yet sure which fight this was. He simply stood between them, the way he had stood between so many things his whole life, his mother's expectations and his own wants, duty and desire, one crisis and the next, and said only that they would speak about this later, privately, and that whatever needed to be decided about Wren and Marigold would be decided properly, and soon. It didn't fix anything. Rosalind still believed, in the part of herself she rarely let anyone see, that protecting the institution was the only job she had ever truly been allowed to keep, and that keeping it meant sometimes making choices that looked cold from the outside. Helena still believed that family was supposed to mean something sturdier than public relations, and that a crown willing to abandon two young women who'd broken no rules had misplaced its priorities somewhere along the way. And Edmund sick, tired, and still, after everything, the only person either woman actually trusted to referee, went back to his desk that evening and did the only thing he knew how to do with an impossible problem. He picked up his pen and he started writing down what he actually believed was fair, so that for once the decision would be his, and not simply the residue of two women he loved fighting each other to a standstill. Whether it worked, whether Wren and Marigold ever fully came back into the fold, whether Helena and Rosalind ever said anything to each other that resembled forgiveness, that part of the story hadn't been written yet, even by the time this account of it ends. Some family fractures don't resolve on a schedule convenient for an audience. Some of them just get managed, carefully, for as long as everyone involved is willing to keep showing up. This final section is entirely fictional. It uses invented names and an invented setting to explore the emotional dynamic a monarch caught between two important women in his life while managing illness and institutional pressure without making any factual claim about King Charles, Queen Camilla, Princess Anne, or any other real person.